Welcome to the Activate World podcast, a series on how business leaders have more power to solve societal issues than any elected official. We explore business activism with substance and depth of thought. As we continue to explore different organizational and business models, today Bud Caddell, founding member of Nobel, is joining us. Bud, welcome to Activate World.
Thanks for having me, John.
Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to start Nobel.
So a long time ago, I was a software engineer, a pretty terrible one. Then found myself right around 2005 consulting for some of the largest organizations on the planet about what was happening with the internet. And at that time, even then, the internet was almost considered like the moon in terms of how foreign and strange the landscape was for some organizations. And then I became, that sort of led me to become the corporate innovation guy and helped, around strategies and new services and new products. And then sometime around 2008, 2009, I looked at my success rate and it was dismal. And I had to ask myself whether it was, the quality of ideas that I was bringing to organizations, or something about the organizations themselves, the environment in which new ideas were trying to take root. It was like dropping a seed on a linoleum floor. So something about, it was no longer about the products and technologies that I was bringing to organizations. It was much more, to me, it became much more clear the problem was how organizations work. Everything from leadership to incentives to structures to systems inside companies, and pursued that path for quite a while. And then in 2014, started my own firm called Nobel to do that full time and to build a team around that challenge. We're still really small. So our goal is to stay pretty small. So we're in LA, New York, London, and Vancouver, and each location has a team of 4 to 5 people. We also keep a network of around 2,000 folks who are either industry experts or regional experts who can augment our team. So when we work here in LA for an animation studio, we can bring on someone from Pixar who did films there, and they can train us in animation so that we can be smart consultants for our clients.
How would you describe the purpose of Nobel?
That's a really good question. I think, over time, it's really been about reintroducing human agency into work. We're usually with a client for quite a long period of time, and I know that we're ready to leave that client when I can see that the people who work inside the organization have human agency again and efficacy at work, meaning very small things in terms of, they see a problem and they can fix a problem and they feel empowered to do so. And they understand that they are the culture. That mental flip is really what excites me and excites everyone who works at Nobel, to give that back to people at work. So work isn't a thing being done to you. Work is a place where you participate, and that's not the world's, that's not the best brevity in terms of purpose, but that really is the feeling and the ability that we hope to instill.
It seems like making a mental flip could take a long time. What's the typical cycle that you would spend with a client?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to engage with us, but when it comes to trying to make meaningful, lasting change, we can be on site for from 3 months to 6 months to 9 months to, a couple clients for a year. Just depends on the size of the organization and the scope of change that we're making.
So what's unique about how Nobel is organized?
I've worked at many consulting companies in the past, and what I've wanted to try to do as I develop Nobel, our principles, our values, and the way that we're structured the company, is to be as close to a workers' collective as we can be as a consulting company, which is actually pretty tricky in terms of how we've designed the company. It's easy to start a farmer's market that's a workers' collective. It's a lot harder when you have intellectual property and clients and things like that you have to design for. But the idea is that it's a few different things. So one, we're in these different cities, and each location really has autonomy and power over itself in terms of the decisions it makes, what to do with its profits, a lot about what kind of services they deliver. Everyone at the company in some form has a stake in the company. If we were to sell someday, everyone would benefit from that. We have broad consensus structures so that everyone has a say about big decisions in the company. And twice a year, we shut down the company for what amounts to a week, where we all get together and we basically reboot the company. We ask a very simple but hard question, which is, if we were to start the company today, how would we do it differently? And everyone has a say in that. We break into working groups. We come out and we're a new company. We do that every 6 months. And I think we're on like generation 8 now of the company. We've done this 8 times. And so, it's a big part of empowering people and also giving people access to the fruits of what this thing that we're trying to build together.
How do you balance the different locations and their autonomy with the greater mission of Nobel?
It's a really good question. So far, because I think we're still, if I'm honest, finding product market fit with our clients and understanding what exactly they need. And every location is bringing a lot of intelligence to the table in terms of London's a very different market than New York. So there could be conflict there. You would assume there might be, but I still think that we're early enough that so far, having a very clear purpose in terms of reintroducing human agency has allowed us to stay in congruence with each other, and that hasn't been a challenge for us yet. Now, as we grow and mature, does that change? Probably. And in terms of some decisions around like who we hire and the makeup of those are wholly locally owned. Like every location again is very different. The talent market is very different for us. So in terms of what we're trying to pursue together, it works so far very well.
So these meetings you hold to discuss how to change, have the outcomes been more evolutionary than revolutionary?
Well, we call it our metamorphosis. It's and we're focusing on 2 different things at once. One is just what's the company that we're taking to the market and what do we offer? And the other is what's the kind of culture that we're building? And obviously they're intrinsically linked. The kind of culture that we're building has been very clear evolution, because I think early on we were very conscious in the culture that we wanted to build and the habits and rituals around it. The things that have been bigger punctuated shifts are just, how do we describe ourselves? What kind of clients are we going after? We have to ask really hard questions in terms of, the packaging of what we do.
You mentioned you're a workers collective. So all team members own some part of the business. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in some form or shape or the other. Like if there's a written, every location lead has a specific relationship to ownership in the business. But then overall, we just have written agreements in terms of, what happens in the sale of a company. And I'll be honest, like that has evolved over time in terms of how we work that out. And as you grow a business, you start to find all of these edge cases in terms of ownership and equity and decision-making rights and things like that. So we've made some fine changes, and we probably will have to continue to evolve. The principles that we really stick to, though, are if there's an event of a sale of any kind, everyone should benefit from that. We want to give a lot of local authority and power over the company for each of these locations to learn and grow and develop in their own market. So while we've experimented with different ways to make that work, those values and principles have always been set in stone.
And I think you wrote about state units versus Padstone units. So does that play into how ownership is structured?
Yeah, I mean, my goal over time is to reduce, my ownership of the company and really build a body of partners across the globe who have as much of a stake in the company as I do. And then people who work inside those different locations also have a stake in their location, have a stake in the overall business, and most importantly, have a say in their location and have a way to voice their concerns to the larger organization.
Since everyone has a stake or is an owner in some way, how do you evaluate each person's performance?
We have very clear goals and objectives for each location. We have a sense of what it takes to start a location and how long that takes and what the revenue curve should look like, even though we know that like every location is offering us a bit of novelty and complexity as we go about that. I can only say that we build in a lot of feedback mechanisms into our culture, and everything from all of our board meetings, which we have every other week, to the one-on-ones that we have with with each other as business partners, are all based around performance and feedback. How are things going? How can we help each other? What's the feedback that we can offer each other? I've found that as organizations scale, your attention can be taken away from the culture and taken away from independent relationships. And for us, the way that we've tried to design around that is to make these rituals set in stone and to be very conscious about like our processes for these check-ins, so that you can't get too busy, that you can't get too distracted, that these are always constant conversations that are happening. So there's not some big crisis moment where we all have to get together and we haven't shared how we're doing or how we're perceiving each other's performance.
So it sounds like your process happens throughout the year. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that you're starting to see even the big consulting companies really question that annual performance review structure. But for us, it's, how do we have that like every 2 weeks, some kind of conversation around that and some personal goals and development that we want to pursue in ways that we can hold each other accountable. And we have lots of different mechanisms for that. We have everything from, obviously, like I have one-on-ones with my business partners every other week, but we also have a stewardship program where it's a sort of like random assortment of folks who develop personal goals for themselves and then have a buddy that they check in with, and we rotate that every few months as well. So for me, the question was, how do you turn that into an ongoing, constant conversation rather than a stilted, punctuated one once a year?
What role does transparency play within the organization?
We started the company as transparent by default. So everyone sees the financials. We review like the entire company's financials every week together as a company. Our salaries are completely transparent. We have a band system that everyone sort of can see what is expected at every band and also where people sit on those bands. I would recommend that if you're starting a company from scratch, but when we get asked about this for our clients, it's one of those things where there are lots of ways to introduce elements of transparency without going fully transparent, because I think there are unintended consequences for that.
How does that transparency apply to equity and pay?
Yeah, we have a band system, and then we've paired it with what we call superpowers. And like, you have bands that have very clear definitions of what is expected for you, and then we have sort of superpowers around that we can like credit to people. Like, so you might be really great at closing a deal, you might be phenomenal at developing new IP, for example, and we can, at the location leads, can give those to people on the team to bump up their salary and things like that. And it's really clear who qualifies for those, because those really have to be true superpowers. That's where we are on that band system right now.
Walk us through how the decision-making process works within Nobel. How do you reach decisions on how to move the business forward?
We use a wide array of decision-making models. We actually built a website and a Slack bot just for this. It's called the Decider. It's a tool that helps us pick the right decision-making framework for the challenge that we're facing. It's really fun and helpful, and it sits in our Slack channels, and it can predict when we're trying to make a decision, and then it interjects and asks us a few questions and actually tells us the right decision-making model to try in that context. And it uses a range of, consensus, consent, authoritarian, like a single decider, delegation. There's even, like, when should you flip a coin, or when should you delay until the last possible moment. We did a ton of research to build that out, and vetting it and testing it. And it's been a really fun tool for us to use internally.
And has it been effective?
It has, really. It really has, because, I think the insight came from that teams struggle with decision making because they jump to immediately trying to figure out the decision without thinking through who should be involved and what the process should be. So we like to say that there's a step before deciding, which is to decide how you'll decide. That has given us, it creates a framework and it creates a playing field where people feel like there's some fairness into, okay, I know why we're approaching it in this way. Maybe this decision we're actually democratic voting. Maybe this next decision, because of speed and the level of risk, we can actually use something like consent, where it's just about no one objecting to the decision.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of businesses seem to miss that. The decision process can get messy and bogged down.
What we've noticed is like, we tend to have two kinds of clients, like very, very large public companies, or very, very fast growing startups. And then the very, very fast growing startups that we work with, oftentimes they've started the company using consensus, and everything is a consent, because it's easy when you're small. But then as you grow, that just becomes really, really hard. And so they start to default then to like a single decider, which is it has its limits as well. And so there's this spectrum of decision making models they're missing out on.
How does the operating structure at Nobel compare to a model like holacracy?
So you definitely, my former consulting company I worked with went holacratic. When I first started Nobel, I think it was like like one of the first big trends of companies trying holacracy. We were called a lot to come in and fix holacracy implementations because people really struggled with it. And some people have succeeded with it, and a lot of folks have struggled. We've certainly stolen things from it and borrowed it in terms of our own practice. I mean, it's a model that's also built on top of sociocracy and some other tools like that. So, there are things around decision making, the way that you create roles. There's some things that really work well in it. For us, you know, I really struggled under that system because I didn't feel human to me. And a lot of people could disagree with that, but I didn't get a sense of like it really like recognized the individual. It's very fast paced in terms of decision making, and we have a pretty diverse team in terms of like how they approach problems and the time they need to think through things. And I just saw some of the parts of it that like really started to suppress like parts of humanity. I guess I'm going to say it that way.
So how much of the holacracy model did you adopt or modify?
I just really like some of the principles around just like roles or like the hats you wear, and you can hold multiple roles at the same time. We took that. We use a Trello board to like mark who has what roles, and we can move those around. But when it came aside from that, like that's just I like that idea a lot. We borrowed that in practice, and when I sit with like one-on-ones with folks, we review roles really quickly, and I just get a sense of like what roles they're really excited to hold, and what's challenging for them and things like that. So I like that concept of it.
What do you see as some of the challenges ahead in keeping your model intact or in figuring out how to modify it to account for growth?
Yeah, I think there's always a challenge. The things that an out of the box solution like Holacracy does is that it tries to answer every possibility out of the gate. And I think for us, we've had elements of our culture that we've tried to be very conscious about, but then we allow elements of the culture to be a little bit like ad hocracy in terms of like, we'll figure that out together because we have the decision making frameworks to do that. We don't have to document everything yet, or we don't have to have all the answers figured out. I think any company as it scales, the challenges that we're going to have to face are like, how do we stay customer centered as a consulting company? I mean, if we're not customer centered, then we should be out of business. But then, when we think of the board of Nobel, so that's every location lead plus someone from that location, we think of the customer for the board to be the rest of the company, every individual employee who works in the company. And as we grow and scale, there's always a tension of like, does the board start to serve itself and its own interests or not? That's a conversation we literally had in the last board meeting, which was, are we serving our own needs in this conversation, or are we really thinking about the people who work at the company? And so that will be a challenge for us as we grow. And then, the thing that is a challenge for just Nobel specifically is that we are a very distributed company in terms of, we're small, but we have multiple locations. And even in our locations, we have a funny condition in which that we don't keep office space. Our clients actually provide us space. And so if we're working on multiple clients, our teams in those locations can be spread across a couple locations. So we're very remote first as a company. And I think that challenges our culture as we scale. And that's one of our biggest conversations internally right now. We're trying to learn from some of the best in class companies like GitLab, or what they've published about themselves, or Git. And that's I think is going to be the next challenge for us in the next 18 months, is how do you maintain a culture in a remote first way? And I don't think anyone's totally figured that out yet.
How do you keep the human connection with your employees as the company grows?
And the thing I've learned about that is I think when we all started to know that we can create remote companies because of technology, a lot of us, and I count myself included, tried to think about how do you recreate the cultures and conditions of a co-located company. And I actually think that was wrong. And so now what we think about is like remote cultures are just going to have to be very different, and they require different expectations from people who work in those companies, but also like a different level of self-care and self-awareness for people who work in those companies. Like, a lot of the challenges we face are, people can feel lonely, and there's only so much that you can do in a remote culture to really support that. And you should try everything you can, but it's also dependent on the individual employee to try to build community around them where they live.
Oh, that's great. So lastly, what leadership traits are vital in a collective?
Definitely the biggest superpower you can possibly have is self-awareness. And that is a muscle that you have to develop over time. And it's also a muscle that fatigues. you have to be aware of how you show up and your effect on other people. And that's a constant conversation that we have. You certainly, in a remote culture, have to have a high level of accountability. You have to really have personal accountability because, no one is looking over your shoulder. You're your own big brother to some degree. And that's incredibly important. And then for us, self-care and resilience is absolutely essential for the kind of work that we do. So we don't really look for culture fit, but we definitely have to make sure that people who come to the company have those abilities.
Well, Bud, thank you so much for your time. It's been an enlightening conversation, as I expected it to be, so I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, John. I'm really happy to discuss all of this.
Activators, join the conversation in our Activate World LinkedIn group. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives. Be sure to tell your friends and colleagues about the Activate World podcast. Encourage them to subscribe, listen, and share from their favorite podcast platform. Let us know how we're doing by leaving a review. Your reviews mean a lot to us. Activate World is a team endeavor. Special thanks to Kayla Waldstein and Kent Nutt. Music by Jason Goodyear. For Activate World, I'm John Mertz.